Hello there, One Idea Away faithful. I want to thank you once again for tuning into the show. And I think we've got a very, very interesting dialogue to share with you today. And I'll frame it maybe from this regard. Have you ever dreamt of walking into work and quitting? Not only quitting, but then going to travel around the world to just kind of set your sights and sails to see what far lands it might be able to take you from. But then it's not actually just about the pleasure of travel. It's actually because you're on a mission, something that you have become so committed to, something that's so meaningful to you, that's actually the reason behind what you're doing. So it's not just to be footloose and fancy free, but it's something that you really truly feel called to do. It's as if your life experiences, your journey to this point in your life was preparing you for something, even if that something was nothing more than a series of questions that you wanted to get to the bottom of. And so we're going to have a very interesting chat today with somebody who's doing just this. It's a conversation that is meant to get to a bit of the truth that lies behind fear. And how is it that we can look at that fear, we can transform that fear so that we begin to live not only more purposeful and meaningful lives, but we feel that sense of freedom and that sense of peace that so many of us are actually after inside of our lives. And this is somebody who has done that. You know, there are ways that he was truly at his end before he pursued this path. He was really truly battling some major life issues as well as addictions before he decided to look at the core of what was unfolding, to be able to look at it front and center and have the willingness to go there, to stay in the pain, to face the pain and the discomfort and see what could ultimately emerge. And what has emerged out of it is really just an extraordinary journey with some answers and insights that are beginning to pop up as a result of the questions that he's been asking. And so it was a bit of this journey. It was this extraordinary transformation that our guest has been through that really kind of drew me to wanting to spend some time here on One Idea Way to have this chat, to share his journey and his stories with you. I will also say that I'm very pleased to say he's a graduate of IPEC, our coach training school, life, business, executive, corporate relationship, career, health and wellness coaches. This is where they get their certification. And today, Matt Hogan, our guest, he is a certified professional coach. Very specifically, he's hired by individuals who are actively making or looking to make a big impact in the world through the causes as well as the people that they serve. He helps them transform the way that they lead and live so that they're able to create a more lasting impact while living a much more enjoyable life. I'll add purposeful life as well to that. Matt's journey has many, many different roots. In his teens, in his early 20s, he struggled with drug addiction, fighting, destructive relationships, run-ins with the legal system. He traded those substance abuse addictions for addictions to work, to society's definition of success, as well as the ideal of being perfect, of being the good boy, as it were. And so he ultimately was forced to look at the undercurrent of fear that was running through a lot of the challenges and issues that he was facing inside of life. And he was looking at those because he had also run himself into burnout at this point. So naturally, when you face fear and you've got it running rampant in all of these different areas of your life, what do? You quit your cushy job that gives you security and safety. You walk away from it. You walk away from this great job that you're leading a national team with very respected organizations. And instead, you leave, you take flight, and you start to journey around the world. And very specifically, it was because Matt wanted to really lean into experiential pursuits, meaning that he didn't want to research these questions I'm going to share with you in a moment just simply by reading a book or looking at the latest research. Certainly, he could have done some of that, probably has. And yet he wanted to experience it personally. He wanted to be able to meet and greet and befriend and interview many different people from all walks of life, from all around the world, as he began to lean into how is it that fear influences the world we live in? And what can we do about it to transform our lives and the lives of others? His travels have already taken him to volunteering in Puerto Rico, meeting, befriending, interviewing people in Ireland, Morocco, Egypt, the Philippines, Sweden, Brazil, Bosnia, and I'm sure many locations to come very, very soon. And so with that, this is where we're going to pick up. Matt, welcome to One Idea Away.
I got goosebumps from all that, Luke. Thanks.
You're doing good stuff. I intentionally, Matt, I left out one key element of your story from your teens and your early 20s, because this is something I wanted to pick up with kind of at the top. And that is that you have faced suicide. You have made attempts on your life back in those early days. And this is becoming something that I'm seeing more of. I've actually been seeing research of how much suicide is becoming an issue among our youth, certainly among our returning veterans. It is something that is a bit more prevalent than we would ever like to see it, ever. And it seems to be worsening in some regards. And I was hoping that you could just share a bit about that time of your life, what you were facing, some of the struggle of what it was that you were going through, but then also to share any perspectives on maybe what's unfolding today and how we can begin to change the energy of what's going on, because I don't think it actually only relates to suicide, but to depression and isolation and loneliness and all sorts of issues that we're seeing on the rise right now.
Yeah, at that point in my life, I was in my teenage years. I was in the process of finishing high school, and when I say finishing, I should say barely finishing. I had a lot of behavioral challenges in my youth, feeling kind of isolated from my peers, not really like I could fit in with the social scene of where I grew up, not really feeling close with any of my family members that were still alive. Yeah. And long story short, I got to a point where it felt scarier to be alive than to be dead. And I ended up putting a bullet in my head when I was 18, and had it, and then survived, clearly, because I'm here. But when I think of that time, the article I think that led to us having this conversation is I wrote an article that said attempting to take my life saved my life. Yeah. Because it was through that recovery period that I learned that a lot of the choices I were making and a lot of the ways I was looking at life in the world were actually what were driving me towards the attempt on my life. Mm. Yes, there was, and I've learned this more as I've gotten older, things out of my control, but there were many things that were in my control, and those were my behaviors. Those are my recognizing my thoughts and things like that I had a little bit more impact on. Does that start to answer the question?
It does. And I'm curious, with the experience that you've had, the years since, the hindsight you have, was there anything, that you could have been exposed to? I'm thinking of, I'm a parent. I'm also a business, entrepreneur. I think about the people and the friends that we have in our lives, and very often some of the things that we hear is unfortunately, the suicide is a tale of individuals that never would have suspected that, never saw that coming. And, I think the question that always sits in the back of my mind is, what can we be doing better? And how can we support a different narrative that allows people to open up about the struggles that they may be facing, even when they're that young?
For me, what I've learned and seen is that trying to fix people never works. Yeah. Especially when we're younger. When we're younger and when we're older, no one wants to feel like you're trying to fix them or be their savior. Yeah. But at the same time, we don't want people that just avoid and shut down and act like the challenges don't exist. Mm-hmm. So there's an element for me that when I think back at that time, because I've had people ask me, what would have kept me from doing it? And I think for me, it would have been a mix of feeling like I had someone there that was just there to listen and got me without actually trying to label me as, well, we need to get you to a therapist, or right, you have these problems, you have all these things wrong with you. And someone that just kind of saw me as a person, regardless of labeling me as one thing or another.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was the biggest thing for me, because I had a mix of both. I had people that were playing the avoidant role in my life, and then I had people that were labeling me as bad, destructive, all those things.
Which almost kind of just reinforces the pain you were already feeling.
Right.
I appreciate you sharing it from that perspective also of listening, because I think we're going to get into this conversation in a very, very different way as we get into speaking about fear. You've also mentioned the issue of shame and how all this rises. And there is a fear, there is a shame that still runs within society of talking about these types of struggles, from, whether it be mental illness or addiction and any number of challenges that we might be facing at any given time, even just the feeling of feeling lonely or feeling isolated or not feeling like you have somebody that's there for you. These seem to be issues that out of fear and out of shame, we don't raise, which, perpetuates this gap of avoidance, of not wanting to see the issue, of hoping it's going to go away or get solved somehow, when instead the more that we can bring this into the conversation, the more that we can find ways of creating that safer, more trusted, or more accepting place for people to have these conversations, to just even be listened to, is something I think that's a key piece. And I think it's still at the heart of some of the questions you ask around fear and shame. So I'm curious how, because from there, you then start to set out and chart the career path. And as you described it, you got addicted then to work and success, kind of the societal expectations, as it were. You have great success professionally in that regard. I'm curious a little bit about that time of your life, of how you did ultimately then start to shift and switch things, but before you really had this kind of bigger awakening type moments and experiences that said, you know what, I want to do this totally different.
It was interesting. So after my attempted suicide and I recovered is when I decided to go to school and go to college. I had never planned on going to college. I, for many years, believed I didn't have the capability of even doing anything like that. But once I set out to do it, because I knew when I came out of my coma from putting that bullet in my head that I had to live a different way. I was told that I would never walk again, and I refused to accept that. Now I know there's sometimes you can't overcome certain things, but apparently my decision that I wasn't going to live with being handicapped made a big difference in that recovery. And I'm happy to say that I'm fully physically capable of anything now. But it was at that point that I knew I wanted something different for myself. So I went through college and finished 2 degrees. And what was interesting to see is how in high school and middle school and all that, I didn't put in any effort. I had bad grades all through. And then I graduated an honors student in college, both degrees. And ended up getting a lot of scholarship money to cover it, so I didn't have the burden of student loans. And then from there, I took my first jump into the corporate world, working for a very well-known corporate company in Atlanta. And I learned very quickly, showing up in my suit and tie every day and experiencing the culture that I was in. I'm like, I don't like this. This isn't where I'm going. So after being there for 3 months, the place that most people would have called very successful, I went in, told my boss that I appreciated the job, quit, moved back to Missouri and started an opportunity with Google as they were launching their internet service. Fell in love with the culture, the innovation. I love their focus on really trying to bridge the digital divide across age and race and socioeconomic status. And so I was just all in, and I poured myself into it. And very quickly, along with me pouring all that energy and heart into it, I started to see myself get promoted repeatedly over and over and over. I really started to climb the ladder, if you will, that we're all so familiar with. But throughout, after the first couple of years, I realized that I became very identified with those positions, with those titles, with the pay. And I really didn't have an identity outside of my job. There really was just Matt and his title, and Matt trying to get to his next title. And then Matt getting to his next title, not even celebrating it and already thinking of the next title. And then still thinking about, well, why don't I have this title or this pay? Or I noticed the pattern, and it was interesting. I had set out when I first started that job in Kansas City, I set out to become a director in a director position. And after 4.5 years, I got the position. But I noticed once I got the position, at that point, I'm like, well, that's cool, but there's got to be something else. It was at that point that I had recognized those patterns of working until I was in exhaustion, of not taking time for my family, not taking time for anything other than my work, trying to maintain physical fitness enough that it kept me sustained in the amount of hours I was working.
Let me ask, because even the recognition, to have the awareness of that pattern that's going on, of chasing the next title, the next promotion, the next pay raise, recognizing the identification that's there. there was an awareness for you that that pattern was going on. And I'm curious if you have any, feeling of what it was that helped you kind of step back a little bit to see that. Because to be honest, that's actually sort of the issue, the question that I hear individuals asking or looking at inside of their lives, but probably, 2 decades after when you had the awareness. It's usually mid 40s, late 40s, 50s, when people start to say, wait a minute, here's what I've done. And okay, I did that. It provided for me, but that's not really actually what I want to continue to do anymore. You had this awareness a lot younger in life.
Yeah, so a manager, my very first manager that really helped me with, I helped him look good. And then he was very supportive of my growth and helping me getting promoted and things like that. A couple of years after he was no longer my manager, we met up for, I think we just had lunch, and he goes, "What's going on with work?" And I told him I just got a promotion. And before he even had a chance to say good job, and I immediately went into how I was already creating my next position. Because that was a pattern I had. I would literally identify a business need, and I would align myself with the need and put myself into it.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes, "So what position is it when you'll stop doing this, when you'll actually be happy for a minute?" And I just kind of paused and looked at him. I didn't really have an answer. Like, I didn't try to say, "Oh, when I get director or when I'm VP or anything like that." I didn't have an answer.
Yeah.
And I sat with that for a while. And fortunately, I started to create a habit of writing and journaling fairly early, mid-20s. And I realized that every single time I got a new position, I was already creating the next one before the dust even settled with the new one.
Yeah.
I was already thinking about what the position might make. I was thinking about how the business could make room for it, how it benefited the business, and how to put myself in it.
Yeah.
And when I saw that happen, because over those 4.5 years, I was promoted 7 times.
Wow.
So there was enough reference points to see it.
Well, enough reference points. And I think it's also, again, it's just to highlight to everybody, I think wherever you are, honestly, if you're listening to this podcast, you've probably started to ask or already are asking a lot of these types of questions. It's not usual to be able to not only have the awareness, but also to then embrace it and see what where it can take you. We'll talk about that in a moment, because there's the one is the reference points that allow you to see it. And the flip side of that is you are being rewarded for the pattern as well, which is part of the reason why it perpetuates. And for so many people, why it perpetuates for decades before it's something that they're willing to say, you know what, actually, that's not aligned with who I am. So just two things that I wanted to highlight also for everybody. One, the importance of having somebody to talk and share with who can reflect back to you based off of knowing you the way that they do, whether it is a coach, whether it's a trusted advisor, that friend who also has that ability to be more objective and open with you, not just the friend who's going to pat you on the back and say congratulations. That's a very important kind of part of growth, is getting that reflection back to you, but also from somebody else's perspective at times, because they're going to see things you don't. And part of the way that you develop that on your own awareness, I love the fact that you mentioned journaling. That's a practice I personally also use. It's something I recommend to a lot of clients that I work with, because it's amazing when you start journaling what your experiences are and then occasionally inserting your own questions to reflect back on your own experiences. All of a sudden you start to see the stories you're telling yourself in a very, very different light. And you highlight that quite well.
It's going back to your point about whether it's an advisor or a coach or a friend. Yeah. We need someone in our life that's willing to say the things to us most people won't.
Absolutely. So what was either the experience or set of experiences that then in, only whatever was about 1.5 years ago, right, that you quit, walked out. So take us to kind of leading up to that moment of saying, you know what, this isn't the path for me. I do want to do this differently. What enabled you to kind of own that choice?
I had early ideas that my time was about up. I was getting to a place where it wasn't that the job wasn't fulfilling, because I believe that any suffering or pain or we experience is often we're a victim of our thinking rather than a victim of our circumstances. But I did believe that I could spend my one life focusing on something greater, at least more meaningful to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I coordinated to where I could move to Austin, Texas, and still use my job because Google had expanded there at that point. And same time that I made the decision to move to Austin, I joined IPEC. And during Mod 1, I remember me talking about, well, I'm finally working through some fear of traveling abroad that I've been wanting to do forever. And I went and spent 3 weeks backpacking around the Philippines. And I wasn't there for very long, and I had filled up 3 notebooks full of journaling about my sensory experience in this new environment that is starkly different than the United States. And in so many ways. And I figured out pretty quickly that I can't stay in a job where I'm only allowed to do this once a year. I made that decision right then and there. And it was when I came back that I was like, now I'm going to start figuring out, how do I make this coaching practice a real thing? How do I go about lining my life up in a way to where I can travel while running a business? And I remember being in Mod 2. For people who are listening that are not in IPEC, there's 3 live weekends that you go to, and they're some of the most transformative time live experiences I've ever had in my life. And I remember being in Mod 2 and asking, I was caught up in my thinking, how do I quit my job? How do I quit my job? I can't quit my job, but how do I do it? I had the golden handcuffs. I've got benefits, good pay, all these security things that want to keep me in place. And I'm just like, over and over, how do I quit my job? And the gentleman leading the class, he goes, well, Matt, you know how to quit your job. You just go in and tell your boss you're leaving. Because I think you might be asking the wrong question. And he was right. And so I sat with that for a while and had some more coaching around it, which Mod 2 was transformative in the standpoint of helping me get to a place of readiness to do what I knew I wanted to do. That I will always think back to that weekend as one of the most beneficial times spent in my life. Because it was actually a few weeks later when I was having an interaction with my boss, and he was talking to me about how it seemed like I wasn't as engaged as normal. And he was right, because on the outside of work, I was going through IPEC. I was going through a sales and marketing program for coaches, which came with its own learnings. And there was a part of me that wanted to act like everything was okay. And, I'm in this for the long haul. And he asked me, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And I said, traveling the world, running my own business. And I could tell he was a little concerned, but I don't think he took too much heart to it. And then finally, a couple of days later, I'd already mapped out that if I use my savings while I work on creating clients and building my business, I would be okay until X date. I didn't ignore the practicals. Like, there are very practical things we have to think about. Like, I had to pay my loan for IPEC. I had to, I had a vehicle, and I had to think about, okay, well, if I'm traveling, lodging, food, airfare, trains, all that stuff. So I didn't just stay with the side of creativity and inspiration. I connected to the practical side too. But at that moment, when I knew the practical side was actually lined up and the rest was really just about my fear, I finally just decided, I was like, it's time. And I set up a meeting with him and had the conversation with him. And I promised him, I was like, I will give up to 5 months, whatever you need to transition someone new in and transition over the business, because I was managing a team of 80 people around the country. And a decent sized chunk of business. And so I gave them that. And then once we agreed on what my exit plan looked like and everything is when I booked my ticket. And I booked a ticket to Ireland to a friend's wedding, and that started it all these other travels that we've kind of talked about a little bit.
That's excellent. So a couple things I want to highlight for everybody. First is, I love the reframing there of how am I going to, how do I quit my job? How do I quit my job? because what you were then doing and kind of guided to is really the questions we ask ourselves. We want to question, is that really the question? Meaning, what's the real question I'm asking? What's the energy underneath it? What's the thinking, the drive behind what I'm really asking right now? Because the deeper you get and the more core that question gets, as Matt, you just exhibited, the answers are going to change substantially. The way you look at things and what you can then do from that going to change immensely. The other standpoint, which is a wonderful way of also describing it, because I really appreciate, sharing that this was not just a, guys, I quit my job, booked a ticket the next day, and oh my gosh, everything worked out. That's not this process. It is practical. And what's really, I think a wonderful highlight of what you also shared in that is that if you go through the practical side and maybe even come up with one or two contingencies and fallback plans and safety nets and kind of do your thinking, don't overthink it, but lay it out, what you begin to realize is what you're left with is fear.
Right.
And that's where the work really, so to speak, begins. And I guess that's the part that I want to turn to, is that, you ask these wonderful questions, right? Of how does fear influence the world that we live in? And then how can we transform it to transform our own lives and the lives of others? And I'm curious on that side of when you really truly started to turn towards your fear, how did you begin to work with it? What was the beginning of being able to face what was really going on so that you would then have the courage and the confidence to take the steps that you were looking to take?
The greatest insight that I ever had around fear was that fear is not always reality.
Mm-hmm.
And that it starts with a thought. Even though we may notice the feeling in our body first, or we may just feel uneasy and we may not even realize we're afraid of something, it always starts with a thought. And going back to that statement that oftentimes we're not a victim of our circumstances, we're a victim of our thinking. It was a really great insight for me to realize, to be able to slow down in any moment that I'm feeling anxious, nervous. Like even getting on this call today, I could feel myself a little tight in the chest because the electricity went out, the Wi-Fi went down 10 minutes before our call. And I was like, oh man, and this, we've had this plan for months.
Yep.
But really slowing down and observing, what are my thoughts right now that are creating this emotional experience that are making me feel afraid? And sometimes we don't recognize what those thoughts are. It's called thought recognition. We can have thoughts running that we don't even know we're running. Yeah. And that's where journaling has really helped me.
Yeah.
Because I can ask myself, okay, I recognize that I feel uncomfortable right now. What are the thoughts that are running in this situation? And then from there, I could stack those thoughts up against what was reality.
Mm-hmm.
Like one of the big things for me when I quit my job was like, oh, I'm going to quit my job and my boss will make sure I never have another job again. If I leave and go travel, no one would ever want to hire me again if this business thing doesn't work out.
Right.
And I put those down and then I question those. I'm like, how true is that? Those kind of things. And really just find out what's the reality behind what I'm saying is going to happen. Because when you realize a lot of times it's not real, you also will come up with new insights about, actually, this is a compass. This is a compass to point me in the right direction.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that I discovered before I started my traveling and left my job was, me as an employer and all the people I've hired, I would be more likely to hire someone that's traveled the world and got to know cultures all over the place than someone that's sat in one place and not really ventured out into the world to better understand what makes humanity so uniquely beautiful. Because we're all the same in so many ways, but we're so uniquely different.
Yeah.
So that was a lot of what it was, really slowing down to the speed of life and really paying attention to what was going on up here rather than what was going on out there.
Yeah. Again, you highlighted very well, and it's that at any given time, we've got these, what I'd call surface level thoughts that are running, which is just the mind chatter that's going all the time. But what you really started to ask was, again, what's underneath it, just like you did with getting to what was the real question that was there. What are really the thoughts that are governing the way that I'm feeling right now? And that, again, allows you to get into a very different level of investigation. Part of it to confirm, are these thoughts even based in reality? Are they just one perspective of many that I could have right now. And being able to weigh those and be able to pull those out and work with each of those really begins to distill things so that you can come up with a very viable way to move forward. You could also start to do some pretty incredible reconditioning in the way that we think, the way that we perceive. So before I want to ask about some of the experiences with traveling, but I guess one of the other.
Do you mind if I
Yeah,
add
go ahead.
something?
Go ahead, please.
I was thinking about it as you were said, add something if you want to.
Yeah.
What I've noticed has occurred over the months since these experiences is that now, if I'm feeling my chest tighten, I'm feeling my palms sweat, or I'm seeing myself hold back, maybe I want to ask someone out on a date, but I'm hesitant to do it. I can go, oh, there I go getting lost in my thinking again.
Mm-hmm.
Recognizing like, well, she may say no, or she may laugh at me. And the truth is nothing's ever happened yet. And so when I realized I've gotten better and better, just being like, oh, I'm lost in my thinking again.
Yeah.
And it's kind of it becomes a game after a while.
Yeah.
I just want to note that.
I'm trying to remember. I think it was Mark Twain who had said, I've suffered a great number of tragedies in my life, but the truth is most of them never happened. And it's exactly what you're describing, right? It's the tragedies that we're creating through the stories and the thoughts that we run through our minds before we even have the experience that we started thinking about. And to your point, when you get aware of these different responses, you can catch yourself getting lost in your thoughts and within that chain reaction. I think the other thing, which is, everybody that listens to the show, and if you're new to tune in, you can go back and listen to other shows with Stephen Hayes and Stephen Porges about the way that our nervous system operates as an example. But it's our physiology, because of the survival instincts that we have, tends to lean itself towards protecting us. And so our thoughts and our survival mechanisms kind of kick in from that regard. But the more and more that we practice being aware of, being mindful of exactly the feelings, the response that Matt, you just described, we can breathe into those moments. As just an example, you can kind of regain control of your nervous system through breath. And it allows you to reconnect to your higher brain, to your executive function. And in those, you can start to remind yourself of, wait a minute, this isn't real. This hasn't happened yet. These are just thoughts that are running through my mind right now. These are the beliefs that I actually have. Here's what I've decided to commit myself to. Here's what my values are. And kind of remind yourself of, here's why I am going to move forward. But it takes practice. And it does create rewiring. And it's been proven out in research and MRI machines and everything else. It truly does create major rewiring. But it starts with the awareness and just kind of beginning to catch yourself. It's just the very, very beginning of this process that you just described.
Right.
The question I wanted to come back to, again, beyond the many people here that would love to maybe go out, quit their jobs, make a major change, whether it's in their life or their career or otherwise, and we're talking about fear and we're going to continue to, but there's another element here of what you're up to that's very mission driven. Like, this is something that you feel very compelled and very committed to bringing about within the world, is this kind of investigation and unearthing or unmasking of what fear is, so that we can learn to live with it and work with it in a completely different fashion. I think there's many people out there that are I see people waking up to this idea of bringing much more purpose and meaning into their lives. And there might be things that are little inklings of what they may want to do or what they're beginning to think about. And yet we don't pursue them. We wait 20 years in the job that we have or the relationship we have or otherwise, and we don't go in that direction. For you, you not only embrace this, but you knew that this was the path for you. I'll say at this time. Things are subject to change over the course of a lifetime. But right now, it was something that resonated very deeply with you. And I'm just curious if you could speak to how when a purpose, when something that is that meaningful sinks in for you, how do you recognize it in a manner that you can trust it and say, this is something I really want to lean into and go with, as opposed to something that might just be a fleeting daydream to make me feel better about my situation?
Well, there's going back to what we said a minute ago about the starting point of figuring out our thoughts and we're getting lost in our thinking. One of my biggest challenges, and I know many other people struggle with this, I had obsessive compulsive thoughts about the future. I needed to know that no matter what I did, I was going to be safe. This plan was going to work out. My business was going to be thriving. I wasn't going to get rejected. Everything was going to be sunshine and rainbows.
Yeah.
That was the mentality I had. And when there was missing variables, my mind would spin. my mind would spin. And you can't, going back to what you said, can't have creative thought from that place. You can't develop solutions that actually will help you create successful opportunities or experiences in the areas that they're worried about.
Yeah.
And so going back to identifying purpose and trusting, I look at two sides of it. I look at the side that is, have you ever read the book, Slowing Down to the Speed of Life?
No.
It's a really good book that talks about two types of thinking. There's the free-flowing thinking and then the processing thinking. Free-flowing is our creative side. That's where inspiration comes from. It's where creativity, it's where like what we call it our inner wisdom, intuition, those kind of things. Yeah. And then there's the processing, the computer side. That's how we plan. That's how we budget something out. That's how we do those kind of things. The free-flowing side operates best when there's missing variables.
Yeah.
The computing side short circuits when there's missing variables, and you try to use that type of thinking to solve for something. Yeah. And I share that because both modes of thinking are needed to do well in our lives. Yeah. But we have a tendency to use the wrong type of thinking for the wrong situation.
Yeah.
So for me, and I want to try to be practical in this example rather than theoretical, my experience was I had to connect to what was it that I felt called to do? What was I passionate about? And one of the things that really helped me do that was I did what you may have heard as a deathbed exercise. And it was really a very experiential experience of imagining myself being on my deathbed, looking back over my life and looking at how I spent all my time. Yeah. And thinking about what difference did I make in the world and in my life based on the path I was on compared to potentially an alternate path. Yeah. So that helped me with the free flow thinking. That helped me really come up with what is it I want to do? What am I pulled to do? And then once I connected to that, I switched over, and again, this is practice, to, okay, what are the practicals? All right, I do need a budget. How much is this budget? What's my monthly expense? How long can I go before I absolutely need to make money? Who does this impact? Children, spouse, those kind of things. What are my bills? All those. But it was using them in a way that supported the specific need in that moment.
Yeah.
As far as trust goes, I think some of the greatest things we can do is look back at our own history and maybe look at reference points where we've been successful in moments we thought we couldn't before. You can do that, but there's also, I love the conversation around action, because action is necessary. If we just live in our head, nothing gets done, but we can take too much action and do too much and actually create more problems.
Yeah.
So that's why I always like to talk about intentional action. So if you don't have reference points in something you're going into, take one small step. Start building those reference points, because a lot of times what keeps us from actually taking that first step is we're thinking about step 12 instead of the first step.
Yeah.
And that's overwhelming in and of itself.
Yeah. There's I think it's one of the things that sometimes does get left out of this type of conversation is the trial period, the experimentation period. Try things on for size, take one small step, do a few things in the direction of to see if it really does fit you. I mean, even in your own story, while the coaching piece was kind of the second piece to it, the very first thing was the 3 weeks you spent in the Philippines to try on the idea of travel, and look at what it opened up to you, which just kind of added, obviously a different level of fuel to the pursuits that you were headed towards. And so there is this path of experimentation. We don't have to have it all figured out. And I love the distinction of the different types of thinking, and knowing, if we're trying to create that vision, if we're trying to see what it is that it may be, let's stay on the free flowing side of things. Let's get some image of where it is that this may take us and some feeling for it as well. And then let's kick back over to the processing practical side and decide, is it a small step? Is it a full plan? Is it the budget? Is it all the other variables that we may need to figure out to support us? And again, I think you also look at it in terms of, you use the description of, knowing that I need to have money until such period of time. That's the other part of this, is that when we make some of these changes, it doesn't necessarily mean forever. right? And I think that's also something else that trips us up is that, well, if I go down this path, then that's it. I can never go back. And that's not what we're saying at all. It's that figure out, what is the window of time that you want to try to create for yourself, to create that space, to go after it, to try it, to do whatever. And it may be 8 months, it might be 10 months, it might be 12 months, maybe it is 2 years, but it doesn't have to be 10. It doesn't have to be for the rest of your life, because you don't know where you're going to be 10 years from now. It's forever changing. Matt, I'm curious, in your travels, you've been to all of these incredible places already, and I'm just curious if there's any particular, maybe even conversations, people that stand out in your mind that have continued to inform this dialogue around fear for you, and what it means, what it looks like, and how we transform it.
There's a few. Let me try and narrow it down to one.
Sure.
I had the opportunity to go to dinner with and spend some time with a couple in Morocco. One was the husband's CEO of a company, and she was a doctor in the emergency room there. And this one example, it was less about fear that I've experienced personally, and helping me realize that what we don't have in our current awareness or in our perception, we're often oblivious is even going on. Yeah. And we spent time talking about the challenges for women in the society in Morocco. We spent time talking about how hard it is for people to get good health care there. But she was telling me stories about people she met that tried to come in and get health care that couldn't, about challenges, specific examples of challenges women face there in that country. And what I'd realized is a lot of things she was explaining, like I felt at a visceral level myself, chest tighten, my thinking spinning a little bit of, wow, I've never experienced any of these types of situations. And she also did a good job of explaining it back to more of a systemic issue, rather than, it's not a situational thing. Like there's systems in place that prevent them from having good health care. There's patterns in place that keep maybe more aggressive or non-equal oriented behaviors towards women. And so for me to learn about these experiences and hear stories that are experiences that I may never experience personally, it really opened my eyes to how little I knew.
Yeah.
Because no matter how smart we think we are, there's so much we don't know.
Yeah.
And for me, it really kind of opened the floodgates of curiosity to wherever I went. So even when I was in Egypt, I had conversations with so many people. I had an opportunity to coach a woman in Egypt to help her with focusing on learning to love herself. And there were societal things, cultural things that were different than, in the United States, there's a huge focus on coaching and self-love and empowerment and success and all these things, but not every country is like that.
Yeah.
So to learn all these individual experiences, and I know you only asked for one conversation, but I have to admit it's really difficult to narrow it down because I talked to such wonderful people every place I went.
Yeah.
But it was really those two conversations stand out the most, is the couple in Morocco, and then the lovely woman in Egypt.
I'm curious in where these conversations, are leading you. You just bring up something really interesting, which is this element of there's the work that we can do probably first and foremost and as a starting point, which is in our own evolution, our own journey of, moving through fear and into greater love and understanding and wisdom and all of these things. And there are systemic and cultural issues that we face beyond ourselves as well. And I guess I'm just kind of curious of in what you've seen and the conversations you've had thus far, when we do move beyond the work we do on ourselves, what's some of the work that we can do in any way to start helping shape, whether it be culture around us or some of the systems that do perpetuate fear and scarcity and lack and control inside of our many societies.
Right. Where I'm at in answering that question, I believe there's multiple dynamics, as you can imagine. One of the biggest lessons I learned in the month I spent volunteering in Puerto Rico for hurricane relief was, don't spend my life assuming I know what people want or need. Just because something seems uncomfortable to me based on my references and my life conditions doesn't mean that it's the same for them. That's one big thing I learned. And that learning in and of itself has allowed me personally to better connect with people, especially people from different walks of life, different backgrounds, different countries, and actually take a moment to listen to what they want, what they need, what their challenges are specific to them, and without projection of self onto it. And so I say that to say, I think it's nuanced. We have to really understand what are the challenges at the individual level, and then rolling it into a collective voice. What are those real challenges based on what's really going on rather than what we perceive as going on? Have you ever read the book 1984 by George Orwell?
Yeah.
When I think of systemic and collective challenges and me learning more about them and wanting to make more of a ripple effect there, a line that stands out to me that sometimes gives me chills. I did when I heard it the first time in the book. The only thing that you need to create or control a population is fear and poverty.
Yeah.
And I saw a lot of that in some of the places I went. I'm not going to name them because I don't feel like that's it would be without enough context.
Yeah.
But when I see that and I hear that, and then hear it in the experiences of individuals, and I can even see it to some degree in our own country.
Absolutely.
In many ways, it's nuanced wherever you go. It may sound cliche, but I think it does start with a conversation. It starts with a conversation of individuals.
Yeah.
And then it's finding individuals that want to proactively do something about it.
Yeah. It's interesting. Didn't quite see it coming full circle this way. And yet we're back at the point of listening to having somebody who will listen to us, for us to be able to work through our own stuff, as well as to feel like there is a connection that we have with other human beings. That's something that proves more and more vital to the just the general well-being, not even happiness, although it is true for happiness as well, that we experience as human beings. Listening to each other to not make assumptions as to what we need, or this person or that person may need, but really truly just having the experience and being humble enough to, not pretend that we know better, to find ways of us gathering in constructive, respectful, beneficial ways, so that we can have these dialogues, we can have these conversations to understand each other, as opposed to seeing each other as the other, which is something that seems to be prevailing throughout all sorts of different society right now. And what you're describing, as you said, it may sound simple, and yet I think that's maybe the power of that simplicity, is that so much can be accomplished by beginning with conversation and really truly listening to one another. And it may open up some extraordinary things. I think the one thing I wanted to come back to as we do begin to wrap up here, you mentioned a beautiful sentiment before: humanity's unique beauty. And I was hoping you could elaborate on how you've come to see that and know that with the many faces and stories and voices that you've been able to connect with over the course of these last many months and year.
One of the, going back to the beginning of this conversation, we talked about creating disconnection, isolation, and separation. And a lot of that comes from feeling like other, or viewing people as other or different or them. And a lot of those views come from ignorance or just lack of understanding. And as I started traveling, I noticed my own judgments coming up in various cultures about the way people live, their beliefs and things like that. And I remember stopping myself at one point. It was when I was in Egypt. And I said, why am I judging them for something I don't understand.
Hmm.
And I ended up spending 2 months in Egypt because I was determined to understand these judgments and why I had them, because I was very keenly aware that the judgments I was projecting on the environment
Yeah.
were nothing to do with the environment actually doing anything wrong or the people doing wrong. It was my lack of understanding and my own ignorance that was creating a separation. And when I reflected more and more on it, I recognized how moments where I felt uncomfortable, maybe in a culturally unique situation because of a language I don't speak,
Yeah.
or a type of celebration I'm not familiar with, I noticed how fear could get in the way,
Yeah.
and the mental chatter would actually shut me down, and I would kind of detach, and I would therefore create separation, isolation. And you think about how that actually, if you really think about that at a collective level, how that creates violence,
Yeah.
how that creates divorce, how that creates so many different challenges we face. And when I became acutely aware to that pattern, I became very more wired automatically to, if there was a judgment, I would automatically catch it.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'd reframe to, what's the beautiful, unique thing about this person? Because often we spend our time thinking about, how is this person like me? Because we want to spend our time with people like us.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with appreciating that. You know, if you're not a fan of sci-fi books, and I am, you probably don't want to sit here and talk about sci-fi books forever. But we can appreciate just as equally what is unique about someone as we can what is similar to us.
Yeah. And
for me, it became a consistent practice to identify something unique that I appreciated in people.
Yeah. You know, it's such a wonderful and kind of beautiful perspective for us to take up right now, because there is such this prevailing otherness that seems to be out there, and I love the perspective and point of first recognizing the judgments that we have around anything that we feel is other or that we feel other from in our lives, and that judgment usually is arising from some place of fear, and that fear is arising from some place of just wanting to keep us safe, keep us secure in some manner, and being able to follow that pattern so that when we see those judgments comes up and that feeling of whatever it is that is associated to why we make those judgments, and peeling it back to get curious about it, and then ask such a beautiful question in your mind of, what is it that's uniquely beautiful about this person or this group of people that I'm spending this time with right now? It's beginning to have us see each other in very different ways, and to no longer see each other as an other, but instead as the human being, the individual, the person that they actually are. Interestingly enough, and again, you've alluded to this before, is that in finding that unique beauty in humanity, we also find just how much we share as well. It may look different or sound different at different times, but we actually do share even more than we know. And it's not just the simple likes and dislikes of or preferences for sci-fi books or whatever. It's stuff that is just so much deeper in terms of us. You know, we want to be free from pain. We don't want to have to go through any form of suffering. We want to be happy and joyful. We want to be surrounded by people that we enjoy and that we love. We all have these types of things in common, but interestingly enough, it can be in seeing their unique beauty that we actually finally get to know somebody and then learn what we have in common. Matt, I want to thank you for the work you're doing, and anything else you just want to add there, wrap up with, just before we conclude today.
I do, because we talked about a few things that I know a lot of people want to do. I know a lot of people that want to quit their jobs. I know a lot of people that want to travel or want to do various things that maybe have nothing to do with those two things, but they're holding back. And connecting to a couple of things. I had someone ask me the other day, I hadn't talked to her since I left on my travels, and we talked today. She's like, so it was a year ago you left your job. She goes, have you regretted 1 minute of it? And I was like, not even a second. Have there been challenges? Yes. Have I been afraid? Yes. Has it been worth every single moment? Definitely.
Yeah.
And I even had a coaching session scheduled for yesterday for when I got back to start processing all of the lessons I've learned, because I just got back this week.
Oh, wow. Okay.
After being gone for 9 months. And I knew that there would be a lot of processing that needed to happen. But what I realized is the person that left last year, the really anxious, nervous, attached to money and fame and success that had a tendency to detach from close relationships and those kind of things, that person's not the same anymore.
Yeah.
And by being willing to use fear as a compass for things that I knew deep down below the fear were important to me, it was well worth the discomfort.
Yeah. I would, I mean, again, it's another point of this travel, the fact you intentionally even scheduled time to reflect on it. Us getting that time to reflect on the ways in which we are changing, the things in which we're learning in our lives, just to create some space to recognize how much we have grown through at any given time, really helps us start to assimilate and foster and cultivate those new patterns and that growth that we happen to be looking for within our lives, and we often don't take that chance. And I think you're up to such wonderful things. You did have that courage to face the fear, as well as the pragmatism to plan it out the way that you need to. And it's I would say I'm looking forward to following the travels and following the stories that you're putting out there. Actually, I will share with everybody, if you look up Matt Hogan worldwide, you'll find the website. You'll find him on Instagram, Facebook. You can tune into all the different travels and adventures that you've got going. But Matt, I love the mission that you're on. I look forward to continuing to hear the insights, not just the journey, but the insights that are gleaned from the questions you get to ask, the stories you get to share of the people that you get to meet, and keep at it. It's inspiring.
Thank you.
For everyone, I really, I think the only thing I'm going to wrap up with today is just to recognize the person that you sit across from at any given time, is to just consider what is uniquely beautiful about them. Just begin there, see what that leads to, and then go back, listen to this conversation. If you're looking to connect to purpose, to plan, to figuring out how you face that fear, there's a lot of nuggets, there's a lot of insight and perspective. You can certainly follow Matt, follow us, One Idea Way online, and get some insight to that. But just begin by looking at the person across from you and trying to figure out what is it that's uniquely beautiful about them. I want to thank you, as always, for tuning in to One Idea Way. We will see you again real soon. And until next time, as you know, continue to enjoy the journey. Check out IPEC's coach training program at ipeccoaching.com/OIA. And of course, to find out about all the conversations, events, gatherings, all the things that we've got upcoming, then head on over to oneideaaway.com/community. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you have, please do us the favor of subscribing, reviewing the show, as well as sharing insights or comments that stood out for you in this episode.